This is a story I heard from a freelance writer friend of mine. It's not exactly scary per se, but it's extremely unsettling. It's going to be pretty long, and I apologize for cluttering the thread, but I hope you'll read it. I usually just lurk, ROM only, but this story stuck with me so strongly that I decided to post for the first time. My friend is a freelance writer, but he's particularly interested in Korean folklore. He spends more than half of each year over there. He jokes that he's always worried he might get abducted to the north someday, haha. I've warned him a few times, dude, maybe stop, but for some reason he's fascinated by the peninsula. Well, calling it folklore research might sound respectable, but in reality he's looking into Korea's so-called dark history. An under-the-radar, murky history that's never officially disclosed. You could call it eccentric, or maybe just in bad taste. He even investigated things like Kim Dae-jung's assassination squad that appeared in a film adaptation. Frankly, it's a bit concerning. From this guy comes a story of Korea's darkness. A darkness that was truly buried away. A history so horrifying that it barely seems real, and no one wants it to be real. The content was so disturbing that he says this is one thing he couldn't bring himself to write down. He also said he's never told this story to anyone else before and that I'm the first person he's ever shared it with. And the reason he told me is basically out of spite. Why? Well, we were both working part-time at a restaurant, and the boss there was Korean. His Japanese was so poor that I unintentionally said, "This is why I hate these Chan types," which sparked a quarrel. After we both cooled off, he started talking in a subdued tone. "So you think Koreans are like that, huh? I'll teach you just how terrifying our history can be behind the scenes." Nowadays, Korea is considered a developing nation, with skyscrapers rising, high-tech computers everywhere, and international exchanges going on. But in reality, that's just a portion of the picture. If you go deep into the mountains or to remote regions, you'll still find villages living entirely off the land. He says that to learn the real hidden history, not something in the textbooks like the North-South conflict or the Korean War, you have to get info from those rural villages. That's indispensable. It happened about 3 years ago. One day, he was out in a mountain village conducting research. By the time he finished up, the sky was already pitch black. He'd taken more time than planned. He considered going back to the village to ask if he could stay the night, but in the end decided to walk down to the town at the foot of the mountain. But it was a harsh mountain path, of course with no streetlights, and his flashlight could only illuminate the darkness and the uneven ground beneath him. He realized too late that he was lost. He was surrounded by forests and darkness, and thunder started booming. Then the rain started coming down in torrents, like a waterfall. He put on his rain gear and thought, well, guess I'll find shelter somewhere and camp out. Slipping over the muddy ground, with his flashlight reflecting on nothing but raindrops, he looked for any spot he could spend the night. Suddenly, between two large rocks jutting out of the ground, he found an opening, just big enough for a single person to fit through. A mine shaft or something? Perfect, he thought, and slipped inside. Naturally, it was pitch black, and even when he shone his flashlight, all he could see were cold rock walls. He probably should have just slept there by the entrance, but his curiosity got the better of him. I wonder how far this goes, he thought, and ventured deeper into the hole. He had no idea how far he walked, but it went on and on, seemingly without end. No sign of an exit. He started to worry about his flashlight batteries. He regretted not just bunking down at the entrance. Either he could keep going forward or go back. But if it ended up being a dead end, he'd have to retrace his steps. Even thinking about it made him anxious. Then, suddenly, he heard the sound of rain. Could it be an exit? He pressed on and spotted what looked like an opening. He felt like he'd walked an awfully long distance. It seemed to be a tunnel piercing right through to the other side of the mountain. At least there was an exit. He lay down right there. He woke up squinting in dazzling sunlight. Gradually, he remembered the previous night, getting lost, the rain, and the tunnel. He stepped outside. Sunbeams poured through gaps in the trees. It was a beautiful sunny day. Relieved, he decided to head down the mountain. A short distance away, he saw an open, cleared area and walked toward it. When he emerged from the forest into a grassy field, he described how he felt in that moment. The chill that ran down my spine was off the charts. It felt like my spinal cord turned into an icicle. What he saw were graves. Graves, graves, and more graves. Graves upon graves toppling over and piling up. Graves poking out from between the weeds. A massive field of tombstones. Most of the engravings were covered in moss or chipped, but they were definitely gravestones, and the numbers were beyond imagination. What he thought was just a grassy field was actually a sea of tombstones, with grass sprouting up in the cracks in between. The entire ground he stood on was basically a mountain of headstones. So many dead. Could it have been an epidemic? Warfare between villages? He only knew that in old times there had been scattered settlements in these mountains, but still. This seemed unlikely. There were far too many. We're not talking about one entire village's population, we're talking about multiple villages, an entire mountain's worth. No, perhaps the entire region must have died for there to be so many graves. He crept forward and looked closely at the writing on one tomb. The era inscribed on them was roughly around the same period, equivalent to Japan's late Edo through early Meiji. There was something else, too. As he traced the chipped engravings, he realized they were all women and children. Most of the names were women's names. There were a few men's names, but the ages marked were all extremely young, which spoke for itself. All these women and children? It was certainly an era of frequent fights, village against village, region against region, country against country, and outbreaks of epidemics. But if that were the case, wouldn't adult men's names be marked as well? Could it be that the men had been off as migrant workers or conscripts, leaving the women and children behind to succumb to disease? His initial fear gradually turned into curiosity. What really happened here, in this area? He decided to investigate. He started by looking through local records, even going to libraries and government offices, but didn't find anything concrete. Honestly, in a place like this, even in Japan, the historical record of what happened in such remote mountains can be unclear. And in a country, like Korea, whose administrative abilities are even more questionable, it's practically inevitable. Even now, there are thousands of people living deep in the mountains with no registered address. No wonder it's hard to figure things out. He gave a wry smile. So he returned to that village from before to ask more questions. They certainly knew about the tunnel and that mountain full of graves, but theirs was a relatively new settlement, so they didn't have much information. Even the oldest person in the village just said, "I've heard something terrible happened there a long time ago, but I don't know any details." Nobody from that era in this region survived, he figured. But maybe the survivors migrated somewhere else. He dug through a variety of materials and kept talking to people. Eventually, he found a crucial clue. It seemed that some of the people from that mountain had migrated all the way to modern-day Russia. Our Russia? You've got to be kidding, I said, sighing. But he went on with a weird, spooky grin. Yeah, I went to Russia. Of course, I don't speak Russian, so I used a dictionary the whole time. Unbelievable, I said, as I popped a piece of cold yakitori into my mouth. So, did you actually find them? The residents of that graveyard mountain? Oh yeah, I found them. I'm hyper lucky. Well, it took me a year, though. You're serious? Totally. But they were impossibly stubborn, so it took another year of negotiations to get them to talk. You're insane, I sighed again. He said he found the elderly man's home in some tiny, ridiculously cold Russian town. The old man definitely had Korean features. But he was born and raised in Russia, so what he told my friend was the story he'd heard from his father's grandfather. Basically the old man's great-great-grandfather. This old man was in his 90s, so the timeline more or less fit. With heavily wrinkled skin and eyes barely open, the old man stared at my friend and began speaking slowly. Our ancestors came to this country over a century ago. Honestly, this story is something we should all take with us to the grave. What do you plan to do by knowing it? There's a mountain of things in this world you're better off never knowing. And this tale might sit at the pinnacle of that mountain. If you still insist on hearing it, you'll likely be damned to hell. Then again, maybe it's just the babbling of a senile old man. But alright, fine. Perhaps it's a story that needs to be known. In the first place, I heard this from my father, who heard it from his father, that is, my great-grandfather. So it's true, there was a mountain full of graves. So that means this story wasn't made up. Honestly, the reason I hesitated to tell you wasn't that I was trying to be secretive, I was just terrified. I always thought it must be made up, that my father made up the story to scare me. But you say you saw it for yourself. So it was real. I've never told my family or anyone else. In fact, until you showed up, I'd forgotten all about it. Now, of all times, someone has to stir it up again. Oh my. My father's grandfather lived in a small village. They had a poor, harsh life, but in those days it wasn't anything unusual. Let's call him Kim, for convenience. Different groups of people came and went, folks from all sorts of races and tribes, so from the perspective of people back then, a foreign tribe was reason enough for conflict and murder. Each mountain was basically home to one tribe. That's why the tribe on the next mountain was nothing but enemies. Kim was raised with that teaching. Everyone in his village was raised to believe that. Probably the same was taught in other mountain settlements. Because basically, you stayed in the mountain of your birth your whole life. You were self-sufficient, never meddling with the outside world. One day, Kim was out plowing the fields. He worked and sweated, then returned to his family. It was a poor and arduous existence, but still, in its own way, they were happy. Then came a sudden shout from a villager, "The mountain's on fire." Kim rushed over, and sure enough, the mountain in the distance was ablaze. This was bad. The fire might spread all the way to them. Everyone in Kim's village scrambled to put it out, bringing water from the river. But nature's power was fierce. Eventually, the flames crept into their settlement, and the mountain and the village both fell to ash. They could only watch. But the real trouble came after. They caught it early enough that most villagers managed to flee. People from the neighboring mountain also fled in the same direction. And there was one mountain in the region that had escaped the fire. The refugees asked for help from the settlement on that mountain, but it was a tribe of strangers to them. They weren't killed outright, but the treatment they got was awful. The men were forced to work like slaves. And the women and children, you can imagine. It was that sort of thing. But, well, you can't really complain about forced labor in times like that. The problem was the women ended up pregnant. Obviously no condoms or abortion techniques existed, so they had no choice but to give birth. That's when it got terrifying. You were carrying the child of another tribe? Enraged men killed their wives or daughters, cut open their bellies, pulled out the fetuses, and crushed them to pulp. And that happened not just once or twice, but many times, truly horrifying. So is that who ended up in those graves, the women and unborn children? Actually, no. They didn't get anything as decent as graves. They were dumped into jars. I don't know why jars, exactly. But every woman and child they killed got thrown into a jar. Maybe on Kim's mountain, jars were used to seal away evil energies as some sort of protective charm? Your friend speculates that might have been the tradition. Countless women and children were wiped out. The remaining women lived in terror of getting pregnant and endured day after day of being used by these hateful people from another tribe. Then one day, a child from that other tribe wandered near the jar and asked, "What's this?" So the answer they gave was, "It's a jar of fortune." Total lie. The child took that jar home. By the way, the men of that tribe had no idea of its contents. They might have noticed women disappearing one by one, but they never dreamed the bodies were going into a jar. The jar's design was apparently special so that it couldn't be opened easily. I don't know the details, but apparently it was made that way. So it didn't get discovered. Starting the very next day, strange things started happening. People in that tribe's homes began screaming, and children started dying. The child who brought home the jar was the first to go. Then the wife of that household died, then a kid next door, and so on. One by one, the tribe's women and children died. Kim's people thought, "The curse of our tribe has befallen them." But it wasn't that simple. Women and children in Kim's group also died. That's odd. Are we being cursed, too? After all, we're the ones who actually committed murder. We'd be targets of vengeance, too. Thinking carefully, though, it was always the women and children who died. The men were never touched. So the survivors rounded up what women and children they had left and fled. The other tribe was too busy dealing with their own dying children and wives to stop the slaves from escaping. They must have done something. It has to be that jar. By the time they realized this, it was too late. Kim's group was gone. They ran all the way to that mountain, the one you saw. They started a new life there, forging friendlier bonds with neighboring settlements this time, because of the horrible experience they'd had. They promised to help each other in times of need and share happier moments together. Although poor, life went on once more. A happy ending, right? Except it wasn't. That other tribe came after them. All men now, they say, smirking like devils. Because they had figured out the secret. The curse was that jar. They had forced it open or something. A jar that kills your children, kills your wives. And it was powered up now. Evidently, the more it contained, the stronger it got. So those men filled it to the brim with their dead wives and children. The rest is just chaos. Everyone was cursed, everyone cursed each other. When the officials in the capital got wind of it and sent men to investigate, the region was already left with no women or children. None at all. The men were taken to the capital and executed. Afraid of the spirits of these women and children, the people in the capital built graves for them all. Before that happened, Kim's group and a few other survivors fled north, and more north. It's a disgusting story. I've heard tales of famine where children were eaten, but this one is just. It makes my skin crawl. But I wonder what became of that jar. Probably the government destroyed it, who wouldn't, with such a horrible object? My friend paused. Huh? I said. I asked again. A jar? Really? Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was a jar. Could it have been a box instead? Huh? Why does that matter? Whether it's a jar or a box, it was just some container, right? But I know that jar. Or I guess in my case, it was called a box. What? Seriously? Yeah, the people who knew how to make that jar, or box, must have come to Japan at some point. What? And they made it in Japan, too. Wha? No way. How do you know that? It blew up for a while on the occult boards. It was kind of a trend there. Huh? What was? Kotoribako. I downed the rest of my now lukewarm beer in one gulp.